Linda Hirsch, and this is EdCast, a program created and produced by educators for everyone interested in education. My guest today is André Aciman, Distinguished Professor of Comparative Literature at the CUNY Graduate Center and Director of the Graduate Center's Writers Institute. Many of you probably know him as the author of Call Me By Your Name, the 2007 novel that was made into a Hollywood movie and was recently honored with the Academy Award for Best Adapted Screenplay. In addition to Call Me By Your Name, Professor Aciman is the author of 3 other novels, including 2017's Enigma Variations and a memoir, Out of Egypt, which received the Whiting Award. Professor Aciman is also a widely published and anthologized memoirist, essayist, and literary scholar. Join us for a conversation on the relationship between author and reader and the writer's craft, next on EdCast. I want to welcome André Aciman to EdCast, and thank you so much for joining us today. In the opening that we taped right before our conversation today, I discussed your many literary accomplishments as a writer of memoir, of novels, of literary criticism, and you're also a distinguished professor of Comp Lit at the CUNY Grad Center. I know you direct the Writing Center, the Writers Institute at the Graduate Center. So I'd like to know your connections to CUNY, actually, though, go way back. So could you tell us a little bit about your background and how you came to CUNY?
Sure. I came here as an immigrant refugee. I had come from Egypt and I stayed in Italy because that was the place where you stayed for a while. And eventually, thanks to my aunt, who is no longer with us, she invited my mother, who is no longer with us, and that's how I came to the United States. I had applied to all the colleges of CUNY because they were the cheap. It was about $30 a semester at the time, and that's all I could afford in those days. And so I came, I was accepted at Lehman, and I was rejected by all the other colleges, and I came too late. So they wouldn't let me in because I arrived a week after classes had started, and the dean of admissions wouldn't let me in. I cursed her many times, and she became a friend at the very end of my stay here. But during those few months that I couldn't go to college, I got a job as a mailboy at Lincoln Center, and that changed my life. And then I came here, and that too changed my life because suddenly I was in the midst of people, all of whom had read many books. They were not ignorant. They were really smart kids who essentially lived in the Bronx or couldn't afford to do better and or to go elsewhere to private schools. And so we were in a coterie of people who cared about the classics, the great books. And eventually I said I wanted to major in Comp Lit, and there was no such thing as Comp Lit in those days. So they said, well, we'll create it for you. And they did. In a minute, it was just a simple affair, and I think they dissolved it after I left or something like that. But it worked for me because I graduated comparative literature. I did all the literatures I wanted. Everything was fantastic. It seemed like the whole trajectory of my studies was tailor-made for me.
That's wonderful. That's a wonderful CUNY story. I also am a CUNY graduate. I went to City College. I had the pleasure of listening to an interview you did at the Graduate Center with Bill Kelly and Colin McCann about the writer's craft, and I do want to get to talk about that. But today I'd also like to take a look at the novel through a different lens, and that is through the eyes of the reader. And I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the interaction between the author, the reader, and the text. So you know, in literary criticism, the role of the author has evolved from authority of all that's written down to practically non-existent.
That's right.
Think
He's
of
dead.
He's dead. Okay.
But he's resurrected now.
Okay. So for you, where does the meaning reside in the text?
The meaning I found that out recently because I didn't know this. I thought I gave the meaning to the book. And I understood that some people brought their own way of reading to it. And in the mix, we sort of blended and communicated. It turns out that I'm totally wrong, that people bring in their lives to a book. And they're always looking for some way to wedge their identities into my work, at least my work. I'm sure they do it with all the other books, but that's all I know is how they reacted to my books. And they find a way of seeking and finding a way to get into the work, and from going in to expand into it and to take it over and to allow the text conversely, to radiate into them, to the point where there is no more author forget who he is. It's the book, and the book says things to people that they understand it the way they want to, and they delve, and then they get very emotional, because if they find the point of contact and they are able to expand it, it becomes a life-changing experience. And that's what I see, and that's what I hear every time I go to a reading and I sign books and people come up to me and they're crying. And I'm saying, why are you crying? And they said, because you moved me. I said, why did I move you? And they can't explain it. And they said, you've changed my life. How did I do that? I don't know. But it's a wonderful way to see that the reader, in essence, is looking for a landscape in which to develop, to grow, to identify.
Now, there's that David Foster Wallace quote. I wrote it down for myself. The reader is absent when the writer is writing, and the writer is absent when the reader is reading. And this kind of makes me think of that.
Yeah, it makes totally sense.
So you recently had your film, Call Me By Your Name, adapted into a screenplay, an award-winning adaptation. To me, that seems to me to be the ultimate reader response. Somebody took your book and decided what was the essence of it for them and transformed it into something different. So I wanted to know, what was your reaction to that? What did you think of the transformation?
Well,
of Call Me By Your Name?
There had been several movie scripts, and I had seen them all. And to be honest with you, I'm not a judge of screenplays. I don't know what's a good screenplay and a bad screenplay. So for me, they all work. But the last one was particularly apt and quite congruent to what I had done. And I had decided from get-go that I would not say anything to anyone, because I know that authors get very sort of touchy and
proprietary,
and they have thought they had the ultimate authority, and suddenly somebody's there changing one place for another or one character for another, and they get very upset. I decided I wasn't going to, and I was letting them do what they wanted. First of all, I had two fantastic persons. One is a screenplay of great sort of fame, and the other one is a movie director whom I happen to have loved because I loved his movies, and I love his antecedents, which is, you know, the famous director Luchino Visconti, after whom he takes complete. So I said, I'm in terrific hands. What am I going to do? Complain? And so they came up with some ideas. I said, yeah, sure, that's good, because I wasn't going to quibble, but I wasn't convinced. And then when I saw what they did, of course I was totally convinced. I love the movie. I love what they did. They didn't do the whole book, and I understand why they couldn't. So as far as I'm concerned, it's a perfect project. I think I'm the only author who's ever said this about his book.
They're going to invite you back to do another book with that attitude. Could there have been an interpretation, however, that you would have not liked, that you would have said, that's not correct, you know, that is not what I meant at all, to use that phrase? Could that have happened to you? Would you have felt that?
I could have, if it had happened. I remember when I wrote another book, Out of Egypt, one of the editors wanted to truncate a particular paragraph. And I'm the easiest person to edit, you know. I'll accept any advice, whatever. But that particular paragraph was key because it changed the character. And I said, no, I'd rather not. Well, it doesn't make sense this way. I said, I think it does. Let's let the reader. And of course, they kept the paragraph after I sort of struggled. So when I think there's something very wrong that goes against the sort of the very grain of a work, I'll quibble and I'll object, but I didn't have to in this particular case.
But as the writer, you do feel that there's something that you do want to say, that it's not just open. I know you said that you understand that when people come to a text, they read into it, they bring themselves, they bring their own perspectives. But as the person sitting down to write the book, in your mind, is there something that you want to convey? In other words, is there an ideal reader for you?
As long as they're intelligent, it's fine.
They can read.
But I see a lot of people, now I run into people in the street, I run into people in the subway reading my book. You think I can hold back and not say anything? Impossible. And they're of all walks of life. So some are young, some are sort of pre-teens reading my books. So I feel, God, is this the right book for you? And but it goes all over. So I don't want to judge. I don't want to sort of have a program. I certainly don't have an ideology. In fact, the book is without ideology, because that's typical of me, is not to have one. And I object if somebody is going to have an ideology or think or cast the film as if it had an ideology behind it.
Or even interpret the book that way.
Yes, if there's an ideology coming out, I will object, because that goes against everything that I stand for, which is to be without any principles and without any taboos and without any taboo about taboos, you know. So, I mean, I'm totally
open.
against, yeah, I'm very open, and I want the book to be an open text. Sometimes a reader will tell me something that I never thought was there. For example, there's a very famous scene in the end of the film when the father is speaking to the son, and the father is giving advice to the son and telling him it's okay what happened, I'm behind it. And he says something like, I could have had what you had, but something always stood in the way, which was something in the book. It's exactly in the book as it is in the film. And some people said, and then the boy says, does mom know? And everybody understands, does mom know, to mean, does mom know about me and Oliver? But other people said, no, it could mean something else. Does mom know about you and the men you could have had in your life? I said, you know what? I never thought of this before. And it made perfect sense. And now I have two interpretations instead of one.
And you can accept the other one
Of
because it
course.
makes sense to you.
It makes total sense.
Right.
In fact, I wonder, why didn't I think of it?
They would say that somewhere in the back of your mind you probably did, but
Yeah, well,
maybe
yeah,
so.
that's a
whatever.
Freudian
That's a
and
Freudian
that's fine.
analysis. All right. Enigma Variations, which I read also and really, really loved, reminded me a little bit, at least the first part,
Yes.
had a similarity to Call Me by Your Name, the kind of first love, the young
Yeah.
boy and the older man. It has a enigmatic title, to say the least, Enigma Variations. I know it has a musical reference. Tell us a little bit about perhaps the title and what you felt this book is meant to
This
tell
book
the
was
story of.
basically, it's a series of 5 variations, let's call them that, 5 tales, 5 whatever you want to call them. And each one it's about sex. I mean, essentially, the first one is about a boy who knows nothing about sex and is attracted to another man. He has no idea why he's attracted. He thinks it's just a friendship he wants, maybe something more, but he has no idea what it is. Then you have him, the next story, with a woman. But again, he's jealous of the woman because he thinks she's having an affair with somebody else. It turns out that he's attracted to the very man that she's allegedly having an affair with. Meanwhile, he's attracted to someone else at the tennis courts, who's a man. Meanwhile, he's going out with a new girl whom he used to know in college, and he meets her every 4 years. And eventually, but he goes also, he's with a tennis player now, as having an affair. And at the very end, of course, there's something new happening. Where does identity lie? Who are we? Who are we? How many lives do we have? How many sort of ambiguities can we live with? Because he doesn't know if he's gay, bi, whatever, or is it just fluid, which is another form of amorphousness. You know, does he want to give it a name? No, he doesn't. Is he fighting against it? He fights about every attraction that he feels. He doesn't want it, but he wants it. Da, 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 da. And I think that this is the fundamental enigma of identity. We don't know who we are. Forget about knowing who others are. We don't know who we are, and we are unstable.
Not knowing who you are. And yes, this character who we follow from
Right.
his adolescence through, I guess, adulthood,
Yeah.
40s, 50s or
Yes.
something, toward the end of the book. So you do see that he is getting to know himself and doesn't ever really figure that.
He doesn't figure out. And
There is a
obviously-
sort of surprise ending, so
Yes.
I'm not going to.
No, it's a spoiler.
I'm not going to destroy that. All right. And the musical reference came from where? From Elgar's?
Well, it's basically, I like the title because these are variations on a theme. The problem with Elgar's Enigma Variations is that we have variations, 14 of them, but we don't know what the variations are of. In other words, the initial
So even the theme is unknown.
The theme is unknown. And I wanted that to be particularly relevant to my book. Not only are they variations, but we don't know what the variations are of. In other words, there is nothing that is the original identity of which all the subsequent ones are just variations. There is no original identity. There is nothing at the beginning.
When I read this book, I was really taken by the main character's constant imagining of scenes, things that he thinks, you know, this is what probably happened, or this is what
Right.
could happen. And I guess I identified with that. I guess I do that myself a lot. And that idea of rehearsing almost his life. To me, the book had a lot to do with regret, loss. I mean, so that's what I bring to this text. I'm thinking about what you said earlier, my own life story. It makes me tune into things like
Right.
loss and regret. So are these the things, when you have people read your texts, do you expect them to pull out their own meanings from the text, or some of what I'm saying, what you intended to be in this text to begin with?
I don't expect that, but I do something that's similar to that. In other words, to facilitate that expectation, which I claim not to have.
Right.
Okay, it's basically what I do is I write in such a way that the sentences are long enough for you to find a point of entry. And if the sentences are long enough and musical enough, you slip in. And you slip in not just as a reader, but as a human being who's basically saying, yeah, I know this. I know where this is going. I've thought of this before. It's happened to me a million times. And basically, the style itself is part of what it is that I do to get you to accept my point of view. It may not have been your point of view, but it becomes your point of view. And the irony of all this is that everybody who reads me will say, you know, you didn't say anything new. I've known everything you've been saying, but I've never thought about it. And I think that's the mission of a writer, is to basically not tell you anything you didn't know. It's supposed to tell you things that you've always known. The vocation that I have is essentially to tell people things that they've always known, but to allow them to find out about more about them than they've ever thought there was, and to do it by slipping into my prose.
Now, is there to you a tremendous difference between writing a memoir and writing fiction?
No.
Okay, tell me a little bit about that.
No, there is no difference.
No difference, okay.
There's no difference because I think, first of all, let me start by saying that when you are a writer, you should be able to write a novel, a short story, a memoir, a critical essay, a book review, an essay for the public, a speech, you have no idea how many in memoriam speeches I've given to people who have died that I didn't even know. Okay, so you're a writer. That's your métier. You're supposed to be able to do this. There is no one thing or another. The one thing that fiction allows you to do is to make things up. A memoir allows you to reconfigure the things that happened. It's not autobiographical, it's a memoir. In other words, you can shift the furniture around to give your life a chronology that would make sense. In
You
fiction,
put some meaning on
yes,
it in some way.
yeah,
Okay.
you create the narrative gives some sense of a development of a plot to a life. Lives don't have a plot. Okay, I mean, if they
Well,
did,
at least
then
we
we
don't
wouldn't.
know it when we're experiencing
Well, we only
it
find out the
later.
plot at the last minute when we're still
Exactly.
conscious,
When we
and that's
look-
not a way of
Yeah,
finding out
right.
your life. But in essence, I think that the voices are the same. And when I write a book review, I'm not only reviewing the author, I'm really projecting stuff about myself in the guise of a book reviewer. And you're always, always, always talking about yourself. And that's what I found, that when I write a book, I always write in the first person. When I write a memoir, it has to be in the first person. When I write a book review, it's in the third person or no person. And yet it's still the first person who's, how shall I say, who's organizing and deploying the argument.
Now, I know I've heard you say that you have taught all different levels of students, from
Yes.
high school or middle school down, of course, to graduate students. What do you see as some of the differences between teaching younger students versus graduate students?
It depends. There is no
I mean-
difference. There is no difference between, say, a junior in high school and an undergraduate and a graduate student, if they are well read, and some of them are well read, or at least they come from a background where reading good, important books, not just the trash that they assign to you in college or in high school. And it is trash, most of it.
Hope we get to talk about that.
No, we're not going to go public with that, okay? Because I always tell my sons when they came home with books, I said, you actually going to read this piece? Tell your teacher that your father says this is worthless. And I said, no, we can't do that. Okay, fine, don't. No, but I do think that what the similarity is that everybody likes depth. And we seek depth. And as long as you can read with depth, you're safe and I can teach you. If you're reading for plot, or you're reading to identify, or you're reading to, because you have a particular kind of political mission in your reading, I have nothing to say to you. So I can't even penetrate to go
But
there.
you've tapped on something, and that is how we teach novels in school.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, there are many students who will feel they're being taught to read for plot. They're taught to read for some pretty superficial things.
Right.
How do you teach a book, and how would you teach Enigma Variations?
There's only one way to teach a book as far as I'm concerned, and that's only my concern. I never, ever teach themes. So
Okay.
that goes out the window. The theme of the child molested by his father or whatever, his uncle or whatever. I don't care about themes. I don't care about symbols. I hate symbols. And people teach you about symbols till you can puke. Because it's easy to teach symbols. The symbol of water in this poem is about life traversing our various... Oh, come on. Seriously, that's not what makes a poem great. You can take a stupid poem and it will make sense. But what I do teach, I teach something that's very difficult to teach. And it's always, always going to be style. Look at the style of the author. Look at this. Look at the sentence. How is it deployed? Okay, how does it organize itself? What does it not tell you until it tells it to you at the key moment? What does that mean if somebody writes a sentence that's short, in between two long sentences? There is a meaning over and above what the sentence says. It's how does the author organize the material that he's working with? And finally, what is it that obviously gave this author joy as he or she was writing? You can tell when an author has enjoyed finishing this particular graph. At that point, you can ask yourself, what was it? What is it that they nailed down and feel secure about publishing? And those are difficult questions to ask because you're really looking at a text with not just a magnifying glass or a microscope, but you're looking at it from the point of view of what is the humanity that is trapped in those words, in those sentences. It's
And
always about humanity.
and that I'm just thinking, as we're sitting here, is that correlating with style? I mean, the style to me seems like a hard thing to teach.
Yes.
So if you were teaching Enigma Variations, I
Okay.
certainly noticed the structure of your book, but then I've read a lot of books. And I have to admit to you, I've been trained to look at theme and symbol more times than I care to admit now. But certainly I was aware of the structure, how there were repetitions, how things came together in
Right.
the end in a craft kind of way. But if you were teaching this book to undergraduates, what would be the first thing that you would do? Or how would you want them to approach the book initially?
I would say, please do not talk about sex, because although the book is about sex, it is not really about sex. It's always about life and how we perceive ourselves. There's a moment in the book which I think is important enough when people are looking out the window and they're saying, which is better, to be in Manhattan
Right.
or to be in Brooklyn looking at Manhattan?
People have that conversation, by
All
the
the
way.
time, all the time, all the
Yeah,
time. And then somebody says, you remind me of that stupid author who's very boring, who does that all the time. And that's me, of course. And I'm making fun of myself. But that's not the point. The point is that at some point, the man in the cab with his girlfriend, they're crossing Brooklyn Bridge, and he suddenly realizes that he doesn't want it to be spring or winter but something in between. He doesn't want to be in Manhattan, doesn't want to be in Brooklyn, he wants to be in an island in between. He's basically saying something it's not profound, but it's that whenever we have to take a position in life, we don't want to be black or white, we want the stuff that's in between. And it's in the in-betweenness that is where we live our lives. And so I would love my students to pick up that paragraph and say, look how it's written, look what's going on. Is he quoting anybody? Yes, he is. He's quoting, Hart Crane because of the bridge. And there's the issue of the bridge and Hart Crane that is also not irrelevant to the subject of the story.
We talk about bridges and rivers a lot in
Yeah,
the
well,
book.
but I mean, there's a sense that you look at the paragraph and you try to understand how does this paragraph close? That for me was an important moment. But I always want people to understand that I write, as I like to tell my students about all the great writers. They never say something up front for you to consume.
You have to.
It is oblique. It is always oblique. And when you go for the obliqueness in an author, you're actually excavating not just for their ability to write well, you also want to coordinate this ability to write and at the same time to conjoin it with a particular vision of what life is and therefore of what being human is, because after all, a book that's not about humanity is worthless. But even if, when you read a book like The Metamorphosis of Ovid, which is about humans losing their shape, it's about a woman becoming a tree, or a woman becoming an ox, or a laurel tree. And what happens to their humanity? They still retain that humanity. How is the poet, who is a great poet, managing to retain their humanity even though they now look like a dog? And these are the fundamental questions of literature. Essentially, it's all about humanity.
So when people come up to you at signings and tell you that
Yeah.
you made them cry,
Right.
then in some sense they have tapped into
The human factor.
humanity
I
and
would
the
like to
humanity
think
of
so.
the book. Well, I would think so. We're running out of time quickly, but I do want to ask you briefly, you did talk about teaching writing, and you do head the Writers Institute at the Graduate Center. Is there a way to teach the kind of writing that you're...
No. I'm
Save
sorry.
your money, don't go.
No, it's
Okay.
just, first of all, I've decided that I will never teach writing again. I've taught it at various big institutions with great prestige. But what I find that I ask students to do, and they don't mind that I do it, but I mind that I do it, is that eventually I ask them to be aware of certain things that only I am aware of. And they want to write for magazines. They want to write to be published. They want to write...
They don't want to write fiction?
Yeah,
I mean,
they want to write fictions, but they don't want to do the kind of things I do. But they won't tell me this, except that I hear myself saying, why did you put this verb at the beginning of the sentence when you could have put it at the very end and made it dramatic? And things like, basically, I'm asking them to write the way I do. And that's not fair. And I don't want to project that. I do want them to read the way I do, because that makes sense to me.
I know you're a big Proust scholar and fan. Outside of Proust, who's an author that was really formative for you?
For you, two of them, or three, maybe four. One was Dostoevsky, and the other one is Jane Austen and Stendhal, because they're all interested in how our mind works. And that's all that interests me. Finally, is how do we misperceive reality, and how do we project our identity on others and misread them?
We are running out of time, but I have to ask you one thing, and that
Sure.
is, I have heard you say Strunk and White are responsible for more bad writing. You must tell me. I have my own pet peeves with them. What is it about Elements of Style that you really don't like?
Oh, I've reread it again a few years ago and underlined everything I disagreed
Okay.
with. It is the mission of Strunk and White, the Elements of Style.
Yes.
It's to become a good reporter. That's all it is. How to write reporting in a clear and persuasive manner.
Short sentences.
Short sentences, and among the worst crime they have committed is they've made teachers believe that using the passive voice is a crime. There are a million other things they've done which are criminal, and basically they debase the English language to the point where no one now has the courage to go against them. If you want to learn how to write well, read a great writer, read many great writers in English, since we're writing in English, and learn from them.
Microsoft Word tells you not to use passive voice as well.
Yes.
Now, what is next for André Aciman?
André Aciman has two books. One of them is a collection of essays,
Yeah?
and of all of them totally related in the same subject. And the other one is a collection of three, again, tales of this kind, of Enigma Variation tales, dealing with sex, but obviously not just sex.
I want to thank you so much for joining us today. It was such a pleasure to meet with you,
Thank
and
you.
and to speak with you. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
That's it for this edition of EdCast. Join us next time for another interesting conversation about education.
We'd like to hear from you. Please send your thoughts and comments to cunyedcast@gmail.com.